I never fancied myself a storyteller, but after 3 decades behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, I've gathered my fair share of tales. Some are mundane, others amusing, but a few, well, they still send a shiver down my spine. This is one of those. Back in the late 90s, I was hauling freight across the Midwest, a routine route that took me through stretches of desolate highways and small, forgotten towns. One particular night, I was driving through rural Pennsylvania, aiming to make it to New Jersey by morning. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on asphalt had a lulling effect, but I was wide awake, thanks to a thermos of strong coffee and the anticipation of seeing my family after a long haul. Around 2 a.m., I found myself on a narrow, 2-lane road flanked by dense woods on either side. The moon was just a sliver, offering little light, and my headlights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness ahead. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, and the isolation was palpable. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure standing on the side of the road. Slowing down, I saw it was a woman, disheveled and barefoot, wearing what looked like a tattered nightgown. Her hair was matted, and she had a wild look in her eyes. Instinctively, I pulled over a few yards ahead of her and grabbed my flashlight before stepping out of the cab. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I called out, keeping a safe distance. She didn't respond immediately, just stared at me with wide eyes. After a moment, she whispered, "He's coming for me." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's coming for you? Do you need help?" Before she could answer, I heard a rustling in the woods and strength, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching through the underbrush. My heart rate quickened. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but saw nothing. "Please, help me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Without a second thought, I opened the passenger door. "Get in." She scrambled into the cab, and I hurried back to the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I shifted into gear and pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a dark figure emerge from the trees, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. We drove in silence for a few miles. She was visibly shaken, clutching her arms and staring straight ahead. I handed her a bottle of water, which she accepted with a shaky hand. "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Emily," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily, what happened back there?" She took a deep breath as if gathering the strength to recount her ordeal. "I was at home, asleep. I woke up to a noise downstairs. When I went to check, there was a man. He grabbed me. I fought back and managed to escape into the woods. I've been running for hours." "Do you know who he was?" She shook her head. "No, he was wearing a mask." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "We need to get you to the police." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." I drove to the nearest town, which was about 20 miles away. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd glance in the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights or that shadowy figure. But the road remained empty. We finally reached a small police station on the outskirts of the town. I escorted Emily inside, where a tired-looking officer listened to her story and immediately called for backup. They took our statements and assured us they'd investigate. As dawn approached, I was free to go. Before I left, Emily hugged me tightly, thanking me for stopping. I watched as she was led away to get medical attention, her figure disappearing down the sterile hallway. I climbed back into my truck, the events of the night replaying in my mind. As I started the engine, I noticed something on the passenger seat, a small, blood-stained knife. My heart skipped a beat. Had Emily dropped it, or had it been there all along? I handed the knife over to the police, but the mystery remained. To this day, I don't know who that masked man was, what his intentions were, or how the knife ended up in my truck. All I know is that sometimes the open road holds more than just the promise of freedom. It harbors secrets that are better left undiscovered. I never thought I'd be the one sharing a story like this. I'm a middle-aged trucker, been hauling freight across the country for over 2 decades. Seen it all, or so I thought. But what happened to me one cold January night still haunts me, and I feel compelled to share it here. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I was driving through the Canadian Rockies. The road was deserted, just me and the hum of my engine echoing through the vast, dark expanse. I had just passed through a small town, its name now a blur in my memory. Nature called, and I needed to stretch my legs, so I decided to pull over. I missed the last rest stop, but the highway was empty. I found a wide shoulder, pulled over, and stepped out into the biting cold. The silence was almost deafening, the kind that presses against your eardrums. As I relieved myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing, just darkness. I lit a cigarette, hoping to calm my nerves. The glow of the lighter briefly illuminated the surrounding area, but there was nothing unusual, just the dense forest and the empty road. I took a deep drag, the smoke mingling with the cold air, and leaned against my truck. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the woods. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted into the darkness, but I couldn't see a thing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain response. Just the rustling getting closer. I dropped my cigarette, crushed it under my boot, and hurried back into the cab, locking the doors behind me. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, eyes darting between the side mirrors and the windshield. The rustling had stopped, but the uneasy feeling remained. I decided to get back on the road. As I started the engine and flicked on the headlights, they illuminated something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure, tall, gaunt, and completely still. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing eerily in the darkness. I didn't wait to get a better look. I slammed the truck into gear and sped off, my heart racing. In the rearview mirror, I could see the figure standing there, watching me until it disappeared into the night. I drove non-stop until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a well-lit truck stop. I parked and sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my tired mind playing games. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I've heard stories from other truckers about strange encounters on the road, but I never put much stock in them. Now I'm not so sure. All I know is that I'll think twice before stopping on a deserted highway in the middle of the night again. I never fancied myself a storyteller, but after 3 decades behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, I've gathered my fair share of tales. Some are humorous, others mundane, but a few, well, they still send a shiver down my spine. This is one of those. Back in the early 2000s, I was hauling freight across the Midwest, a route I'd driven countless times. The open road has a way of becoming monotonous, but that particular trip stands out vividly in my memory. It was late October, and the weather had taken a turn. The days were getting shorter, and a crisp chill hung in the air. I was en route from Kansas City to Indianapolis, a solid 10-hour drive without accounting for stops. The plan was to push through and make it by dawn, but as any seasoned trucker knows, plans often change. Around midnight, fatigue started to set in. The highway was desolate, with only the occasional pair of headlights piercing the darkness. I decided it was time for a break. Up ahead, I spotted a sign for a rest area, one I wasn't familiar with. But when you're tired, any port in a storm will do. I pulled in, noting how empty the lot was. Just a couple of cars and another rig parked at the far end. The place had an eerie stillness, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But I shrugged it off, attributing it to the late hour and my overactive imagination. After using the facilities and grabbing a snack from the vending machine, I returned to my truck. I planned to catch a quick nap before hitting the road again. Reclining in the driver's seat, I let my eyes drift shut. I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by a sharp tapping on my window. Groggy and disoriented, I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. Rubbing my eyes, I turned to see who had knocked. A woman stood there, illuminated by the dim glow of the rest area's lights. She looked to be in her late 20s, with long dark hair and a pale complexion. Her clothes were disheveled, and she had a frantic look in her eyes. I rolled down the window a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need a ride. My car broke down, and I can't get a signal to call for help." I glanced around. The rest area was still empty, and there was no sign of a broken-down vehicle. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. "Where's your car?" I asked. She pointed vaguely toward the entrance. "Just a little ways back. Please, I just need to get to the next town." Every instinct screamed at me to say no. But another part of me, the part that couldn't leave someone stranded, was conflicted. I sighed, weighing my options. "All right," I said finally. "Hop in." She climbed into the passenger seat, and I couldn't help but notice how cold she felt as she brushed past me. I started the engine and pulled out of the rest area, heading east. We drove in silence for a few miles. I stole glances at her, noting how she stared straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Emily," she replied softly. "Where are you headed, Emily?" "Just the next town," she repeated. Something about her demeanor was unsettling. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air in the cab felt heavy. As we approached the next exit, she suddenly turned to me. "You can drop me off here." I glanced at the exit sign, no services, just a lonely country road leading into the darkness. "Are you sure?" I asked. "There's nothing out there." "Yes," she insisted. "This is fine." Reluctantly, I took the exit and pulled over to the side of the road. She opened the door and stepped out. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, she closed the door and disappeared into the night. I sat there for a moment, unease gnawing at me. Finally, I shook it off and got back on the highway. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I reached Indianapolis, I recounted the story to a fellow trucker. His face went pale. "You said this happened near mile marker 150? "Yeah," I replied. He swallowed hard. "There's a story that a woman died near that rest area years ago. Supposedly, she hitchhikes and then vanishes without a trace." His face went pale. "You said this happened near mile marker 150? "Yeah," I replied. He swallowed hard. "There's a story that a woman died near that rest area years ago. Supposedly, she hitchhikes and then vanishes without a trace." I laughed it off, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the chill that ran down my spine. To this day, I avoid that stretch of highway, just in case Emily is still out there, looking for a ride.